I'm not really
like that.
I'm not anxious. I'm aggravated, and I enjoy that.
Oh, okay.
That's something you enjoy.
Okay, well, why don't we get started? Matt Bennett, who is the future new president, starting in June, was going to do the introduction, but we're having equipment issues, so he's gone home to get his laptop. Apparently he lives pretty close. So I'm Norman Hirsch, current president of the APT, and I'll just do an informal introduction. First of all, I'm one of the speakers, and of that. Beth Ash is professor of English at UC, and we'll be talking about Julia Kristeva's novel Possessions, right? Which is also a chapter in a book. Okay. And so we're looking forward to that. I'm going to be discussing Thomas Ogden's novel, which is The Parts Left Out. Actually, Mike Maloney was reading the book on Google Play, and then they stopped at four chapters, and then you had to buy it, so those are the parts left out, right? Okay. And Rachel Zlatkin is going to help me talk about Thomas Ogden's novel from a literary point of view. I'm a psychiatrist, so I'm just going to jump right into that. I should mention some future programs. In March, Norman Finkelstein is going to be discussing poetry and psychoanalysis. He's a research candidate here and a poet. And in May, we're having a second version of psychoanalysis in the classroom, which we had a couple of years ago, talking about teaching to basically undergraduates, I believe. And that's also Norman and Carl Stukenberg and Marcia Kaplan. And in June, we'll have a couple of films, The Zookeeper's Wife and The Measure of a Man. It would be an understatement to say that Thomas Ogden is a notable psychoanalyst. The website Psychoanalytic Electronic Publishing provides access to 120,000 articles and also lists on a yearly basis the 10 most frequently accessed articles, including articles by Donald Winnicott, Wilfred Bion, Melanie Klein, and usually on the list is Thomas Ogden's article, The Analytic Third. His concept of the analytic third, which was groundbreaking in 1994, involved the intersubjective experience of the analytic pair, mostly unconscious and essential to keeping the analytic process going. The most important element that Ogden highlighted was that what appeared to be the entirely subjective experience of the analyst, seemingly entirely unrelated to the patient, would be found to be directly related to the patient's unconscious. He provided two clinical examples. The second one involved a woman who had been in analysis for several years when Ogden began to feel that he had flu-like symptoms during their sessions, but at no other time. Strikingly, he also began to believe that during that period of time he had a fatal illness. So here's someone who has gone to medical school, increasingly convinced that he has an actual illness that will kill him, that only manifests itself with symptoms for 50 minutes at a time and at the same times every week, 4 times a week. This testifies to the power of the unconscious. Finally, he had a convincing fantasy that he was an old man. In the midst of this, when Ogden was reaching for a glass of water, the woman reacted to the rustling noise, turned around for the first time in the analysis, and looked at him. She said that she was worried that he was dying. This led to a number of associations about the patient's mother and the patient's fear that her mother did not want her and in fact had a wish to abort her. Ogden concluded that his symptoms, that he was basically being killed by this patient, was involving a murderous wish and a fear between a pair. and that it had come from the patient's unconscious. He also ventured his belief that his being old was an identification with his own analyst, and that he was therefore replacing his analyst and dispensing with him. Even at this stage, Ogden shows a literary bent and a penchant for the dramatic, because he had the chutzpah to label the two cases histories in the paper, the purloined letter, and this one, the telltale heart. I had to look it up to remind myself that the Telltale Heart, a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, was about a man who killed an older man, chopped up his body, and hid the parts under the floorboards. When the detectives visited asking about the missing man, the murderer started hearing louder and louder the beating of the victim's heart, who had been dismembered, eventually breaking down and admitting to the crime out of his guilt. Ogden wasn't explicit about this, but presumably he is saying that the beating heart underneath the floorboards was that of his dismembered former analyst. Clearly, Ogden had no problem confronting the dark side of human nature, and in fact, he is known for treating psychotic and borderline patients in analysis. So I found it difficult to consider the parts left out as a novel, since I was aware of Ogden's day job, and because of that had an inclination to look at it as a case history come alive, and in that sense at least it's very successful. I was especially impressed with his narration about a woman, Marta, slipping into psychosis literally overnight. This was a surprise, as all first-break psychotic episodes are. But immediately I realized that Ogden had elegantly elaborated the steps leading up to that event, and you felt, reading it, that the psychosis was explained, using the old idea of a psychotic solution to impossible problems. This occurs 2/3 of the way through the novel in a prolonged backstory, which answers the question of why Marta behaves as she does in the opening scenes. I hope I'm not, if you haven't read the novel, I hope you can actually stop me if you need clarification. Thomas Ogden was born and raised outside of New York City, attended Amherst and Yale, and now teaches and practices in the Bay Area. And yet he has written a novel about a Midwestern farm family in the 1970s. So he at least needs to be credited with an imagination, since he had none of that in his background. The family consists of Earl, who is from a small town where he was known as a star football player, and who aspired to be an engineer, but didn't finish college, and who is bitter about his choice, which he looks at as forced, to take over the family farm. Earl is married now for 14 years to Marta, the woman we were just talking about, who is introduced in the novel as a woman who did not want children and who had two. The children are Melody, 15, and Warren, 11. The focus of action is on Warren, who is a champion thumbsucker at home, at school, and in public places. Marta is nothing short of mortified by her son's regressive behavior. She is determined to bring this to an end and tries one strategy after another. Finally, she purchases duct tape and gloves and fits Warren out with it so that he will be unable to suck his thumb, believing that this is foolproof. Earl, who is described as passive and almost cowardly and avoiding intervention in his son's mistreatment, is aware that Melody helps Warren remove the glove shortly after he goes to bed. This goes on for a few days until Marta discovers that Warren's thumb is softened in the morning, and so he was sucking it all night. She realizes that her plan has failed. In the kitchen with Melody, Earl, and Warren, she grabs a butcher knife. I should mention that Earl starts to notice that she's going into a dissociated state, which she had done earlier in college. She tells Warren to put his hand out, which he complies. This is too much. Finally, for Earl, and with accumulated rage, he throws a football block and, because of his size and strength, breaks Marta's neck, and she falls to the ground dead in front of the children. The police are called, and the detective Randy, who is a former teammate of Earl, shows up, and more or less accepts this as an accidental death, especially after Melody confirms Earl's account. One of the parts left out by Earl is Marta's intent towards Warren. He doesn't want people to know that she would go after her own son with a knife, saying Marta just came at him for no apparent reason. Melody, however, fills that detail in. Through the rest of the novel, Randy, the detective, voices some suspicion, but this doesn't go anywhere by the end. The rest of the novel involves the backstory, with Earl going off to college to pursue engineering. Ogden describes Earl as having questions, very reflective, wondering about the lives of others and meaning in general. I had trouble situating that in a Midwestern high school quarterback with aspirations of being an engineer. It seems more fitting as a description of Ogden, a future psychoanalyst and novelist. Earl meets and becomes obsessed with Marta, who is attending college on grants and loans, and who hopes to be a restorer of rare books. Earl is especially fascinated by her self-containment. They begin a relationship, not very passionate and often contentious. Earl learns nothing of Marta's past until her long-lost sister, Anne, appears, and through their discussions, Earl finds out that almost all of the parts have been left out, that there was major trauma in childhood, including incest at some level with the father. Marta becomes pregnant, itself a crisis, and as she is then called to the college administration office, as it was discovered that she had forged her father's signature on her loan application because her father wouldn't sign. Leaving that office, and now we're back to the slipping into the psychotic episode. Leaving that office, she began to dissociate, and she awoke the next morning paranoid and out of touch with reality. She has a prolonged hospitalization during which Anne comes over on the weekends to keep Earl company. They don't have an affair, but Anne and Earl are in love with one another. Marta cannot resume classes, and because of the pregnancy, Earl chooses to drop out and move home, where his mother can help Marta take care of the baby. Earl becomes a farmer, Marta a waitress, and they have another child. Coming back at the end of the novel to the present, Anne appears for Marta's funeral, and Earl is once again smitten and becomes preoccupied with that relationship, perhaps not attending to his children and reflecting as to whether in fact he had some motives in the accidental death of his wife. A lengthy discussion occurs between Warren and Melody, with Melody expressing her fascination with Anne and expressing a hope that something would happen between her father and Anne. Warren forcefully expresses his cynicism, seeing Anne as a fake, and by implication seeing his father as weak, adolescent, and unwilling to deal with reality. The final scene occurs the next morning when Earl goes into Melody's room to inform her that he had discovered Warren's body hanging in the barn. After reading that, I was angry that I had volunteered to discuss this topic without having read it. Why subject an audience to this kind of desolation? On the other hand, the stark confrontation with the damage done by transgenerational trauma, especially when it's repressed and not dealt with, can be useful. Ogden has written a book with his son, a literary critic, entitled The Analyst's Ear and the Critic's Eye, in which he argues against the use of theory in the psychoanalytic approach to literature. He characterizes most psychoanalytic criticism as involving decoding of a text using psychodynamic formulations and interpreting the unconscious of the writer. Instead of dwelling on the psychodynamics of the character or the author, Ogden advocates using the listening skills of the analyst, including primarily an analysis of his own reactions to the narrator and characters. Rachel is going to delve more into this, but in applying some of his ideas, right, to a psychoanalytic approach in this novel, I noticed already some differences for myself. When I applied this, I found that I was much more sympathetic to Marta and much less so to Earl than I was in the initial reading. In fact, I realized that I had bought into Earl's and perhaps the narrator's version of things, that Earl was a martyr, giving up college, giving up Anne, giving up his life's aspirations in order to be Marta's caretaker. But did I mention that he killed her at the end? Okay. I realized that he had been passive-aggressive all along, even towards his own son's suffering while caring for Marta. So since the novel is so clearly connected to Ogden's work in clinical writing, I can't really judge this as a novel, so I'm hopeful Rachel will help it judge its literary merit. Okay. Thank you.
I have a handout if people are interested. It's really just 2 block quotes. The first from the novel, and then the one at the bottom I get to at the end. It's from a book. It's just a quote that Ogden gives about how to read. So I read both of these in my paper, but I thought since they were so long, people might appreciate having access to the actual quotes. One thing I wanted to add just real quick before I get started in an official way is that it's not just that he breaks her neck with this football, kind of hit. He shatters it. Like it's completely shattered. There's nothing left, basically, to her neck. So it's not like, it was not a gentle break, and she was dead before she hit the floor. So first off, thank you, Norman, for asking me to do this. I'm really happy to do it. When Norman first asked me to present on, quote, the literary merit of Thomas Ogden's first novel, a few thoughts immediately came to mind. First, that I was not sure at all about how to choose criteria on what to qualify a work's merit. How shall I proceed in thinking through this 21st century novel, especially considering that much of my literary study has been of dramatic literature, Shakespeare and his contemporaries, or the modernist novel with its free and direct discourse, not the limited omniscient narrators that we find in a lot of novels today. And in many ways, I don't really respond very well to the limited omniscient narrator, especially when I know that the narrator is being written by a psychoanalyst. But anyway, moving on from that question. Secondly, I thought of a CPI panel discussion of Brett Clark's paper, Poetry, Science, and Subjectivity, making a hybrid of psychoanalysis that he presented in June last year, which I attended. And at one point, Brett Clark stated that psychoanalysts could only ever aspire to being second-rate poets. It's probably good that Norman Finkelstein is not here. And I am paraphrasing. I'm not remembering this exactly, but that's my recollection. And at the time, I remember I was filled with relief because when I was writing poetry, I was convinced I was third-rate at best. So that was, a relief. But even with these doubts, thirdly, I found myself caught by the title of a novel I'd not yet read, The Parts Left Out by Thomas Ogden. I take the title today of Ogden's novel as my theme for my time with you. It is a title that holds significance in our mutual fields, literature and psychoanalysis. I'll begin with literature, but I believe by the end, I will have come full circle back to Ogden again, psychoanalysis, and what he calls transitive reading. First, just for some context, my PhD in literature is about 5 years old now, and I find myself in a place that I think a lot of recent graduates find themselves in their first years outside of the graduate classroom and under their advisor's direct influence. in the relative silence, the ideas and the themes and the concerns that first brought me to graduate school reawaken in a fresh light. And what I've always loved about literature, regardless of the time period, is how I'm able to have access to a form of subjectivity or consciousness as it presents itself in the literature. And I get very wrapped up in different time periods just because of what's happening in that period. I'm going to take, just for this talk, Shakespeare. His great tragedies, his soliloquies, have been cited as an expression of inwardness, and this gift, Stephen Greenblatt, has argued grew out of a simple practice, which was one of excision. Throughout his career, Shakespeare famously borrowed plot lines from multiple sources, and then he would intertwine the two plot lines through 1 to 2 characters who would cross between the two narratives. But he also subtracted a character's motivation or backstory, especially in his most famous tragedies, thus creating the inner mystery that make his tragic characters so compelling. For example, in the original source material for Hamlet, the title character is much younger and pretends to be mad so that his uncle, the king, does not murder him before he is of age to take on the crown. Shakespeare not only ages Hamlet, he subtracts the clear-cut cause for Hamlet's madness and delves into a mind with more questions than answers. It is the parts left out that make for a character that seems so very human. When I first read Ogden's novel, like Norman, I had difficulty separating some of Ogden's psychoanalytic theory from his characterizations. In his first chapter, he describes Marta as a wife and mother driven by forces from outside and beyond her control. She's obsessed with her son's thumb sucking, and she will put it to an end. And this is the first block quote, which is on pages 12 to 13 in the novel. Marta was now living in a state of mind in which one does not consider. One is swept along in a torrent of action. She could feel the direction in which she was moving, but felt nothing about it except its imperative force. What was about to happen would happen, regardless of any interference on anybody's part. Marta did not know the source of the idea that had taken hold of her. She was merely its agent, not its architect. The idea may have had its origins in something her mom or grandmother or even a friend had told her when she was a child, or in a conversation she overheard, or perhaps in a dream, or maybe it was a plan solely of her own making that had been spawned months or years ago, which was now convulsively transforming itself from an imagining into something that could not be more real and could not be stopped. That sounds very much like some of his psychoanalytic theory. Passages such as this, on top of the fact that the entire impetus of the novel's action rests on the thumb sucking of an 11-year-old boy, which I thought even psychoanalytically was a little obvious, seemed glaring pronouncements of Ogden's true calling as a psychoanalyst. However, having read the novel in full, I have reached a revised conclusion that Ogden was indeed more artful than that when it came to the parts left out. First, Ogden alludes to a history of sexual abuse. He offers several subtle indications that Marta's father molested both Marta and her sister Anne when they lived at home as children. Notably, Marta lives with one of her teachers for her final year of high school. Ogden does not dramatize this abuse. He leaves these parts out, and in doing so, he writes a novel that enacts not the abuse, but the psychological effect that abuse had on Marta. If it is repressed for Marta, it is repressed for her readers too. Secondly, Marta is the part left out of the novel. Her two children, Melody and Warren, have never met their mother's family, have no knowledge that Marta has a sister and they an aunt, Anne. They have no idea what their mother has endured in her life. To them, she is a mother of demonic presence, a powerfully coercive personality with no backstory. It is not even clear that Marta's husband Earl has a full picture of her history or the degree of her suffering. Marta's absence is noted, in fact, from the first page of the novel, when the police officer called to the house because of her death cannot even remember her name. This absence is enforced by the novel's end when Marta's sister Anne returns to take her place in the family circle at her very funeral. Earl has loved Anne from the start, Anne has loved him, and Melody now wants to grow up to be just like her aunt. Thirdly, when Marta has her breakdown in the present, the trauma she experienced growing up is not brought to bear on the current events that provoke her collapse. Her father clearly plays a part in both storylines, that of her abuser and that of her accuser. He threatens to sue Marta for forging his name on her college financial aid documents. During her treatment, there is no effort to dig deeper than the humiliation she feels at having been caught for lying her way into and through her college career. Because Ogden leaves parts of Marta to silence and outside of the language he's writing in the novel, he creates a character that makes room for the minds of the novel's readers to enter her experience. In his introduction to Creative Readings, Essays on Seminal Analytic Works, a book published the year before this novel, Ogden describes creative reading as follows, and this is my second block quote. In this, he's describing what it's like to read Melanie Klein and how when he's reading Melanie Klein, he becomes a Kleinian, and that's what happens for all of these people, and that he encourages his students to read different psychoanalysts in this way. Giving oneself over to the experience of reading is by no means a detached or passive event. One is not only allowing foreigners, words and sentences that are not one's own, into oneself, one is also permitting oneself to be read by that foreigner, the writing. Of course, the writing cannot read us, but it can present us with a perspective on ourselves from which we have never viewed ourselves and may never again be able not to include in the way we view ourselves. The experience of being read by the writing, making use of the writing to engage in a form of self-reflection that is unique to the experience of reading, need not feel invasive or intrusive. On the contrary, in being read well by what one is reading, in using the experience of reading to read oneself, the reader may feel that he is becoming alive to a way of being that he has always felt to comprise an essential aspect of himself or herself, but has not known how to put into words, or how to more fully become the person who thinks and expresses himself in that way. The breakdown that Marta suffers is one of the most affecting I have read for its lack of drama. I'm used to Shakespeare. Everybody's emoting. And this was very much in contrast to that. She stops bathing, and her odor is her most pervasive message. Her inability to otherwise communicate coincides with the reader's lack of language for how Marta felt or what she thought. And as a reader, I found myself sharing in her experience of some shock, even not knowing what exactly that shock was. For me, this is the artistry of Ogden's novel, more than an 11-year-old thumbsucker, or his descriptions of characters driven to speak or behave in ways they cannot control or comprehend. It is the creation of a character whose personal narrative is largely absent from the novel, and whose humanity is never fully grasped by any other character. Her annihilation is complete, yet the novel's action circles that absence. It is those parts left out that structure the experiences of every character who shares a room with Marta Bronfman. Marta is a tragedy, one that sucks in the lives of her family members and brings me back to Ogden, the psychoanalyst. I imagine him sitting in his chair during a session, his abstract paintings behind him, listening to a patient's words, but observing the quirks of gesture, the shifting body posture, the blank stare, or catching the odor of a Marta that tell the story of parts left out and the mystery that can make a human seem so human. Thank you.
We might need to take a break for a technical issue here.
I'll take a moment just to add something. I mean, it was clear to me that there was some kind of connection between the case I first mentioned, The Telltale Heart, and the novel. And there's some obvious connections in the sense of murder. So I'm curious as to what other people think in terms of trying to make that connection, because I have a feeling that it is very connected. So thanks. I do think that he gradually reveals a more psychoanalytic take. In the beginning, I was actually thinking about this in regards to, I think it's in 2 weeks, the Groundhog Day. That there was, Groundhog Day basically involves a kind of treatment where the guy keeps cycling through. It's a cognitive behavioral treatment. You never find out why he is the way he is. And the initial part of Ogden's novel, this woman is obsessed with her thumb-sucking kid, and then she wants to kill him and gets killed. It's very, I mean, it could be a drama on TV that's very kind of superficial, but you do gradually, now you don't completely find out any of the details, but so that's my comment on that. Should we go ahead with?
Sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I found this presentation really interesting in light of Kristeva's novel. Julia Kristeva also is a psychoanalyst, but her perspective is the more psychoanalysis, the better. And we have to be trained up by the novel, and I think it's in compelling ways. The quotation from Ogden that really seemed useful to me is this one, the experience of being read by the writing. That kind of self-reflection is something that Kristeva is really interested in our doing in reading this novel, Possessions. The other dimension of commonality that I'd like you to think about is psychosis. Psychosis is very central to Kristeva's novel as well. But I'm going to contextualize this in terms of contemporary society, because that's what Kristeva does as well. It's not just a matter of an individual psychosis, but what that psychosis might mean for us reading the writing, or reading ourselves in the writing. That's kind of the point of the text. Please bear with me, because this is a chapter from a book that I'm writing on, and the chapter is actually a comparison between Kristeva and a speculative science fiction writer, J.G. Ballard, both of whom make use of the analytic situation very integrally to the plot of their novels. And so at points, I'm just going to have to leave Ballard out and find my place in the text, so please bear with me with that. The name of the chapter is Reflections on Violence, Psychotherapy and Virtual Persons in the Whodunits of Julia Kristeva and J.G. Ballard. So I'm just doing the whodunit of Julia Kristeva, Possessions. Psychoanalyst and theorist Julia Kristeva is not especially well known as a fiction writer, but indeed she has written 2 detective novels, Possessions in 1998 and Murders in Byzantium in 2006. In what follows, I focus on Possessions. Kristeva's narrator, Stephanie Delacour, is a journalist who assists her boyfriend, Chief Inspector Rilsky, in crime solving. But the novel isn't merely a crime thriller, as you would probably suspect. Kristeva's narrator, Stephanie, tells us that for her, the point of criminal investigation is to track down, quote, a complex truth in a way that challenges the whole of society. As a speculative whodunit, the novel resonates with the complex truth of psychopathy in ways that promote interrogation of the social order rather than any pat restitution. Typically, in detective fiction, the social order is discombobulated by the murder, and by the end, the police figure it out and we all feel safe. The point of this novel is not to feel safe. The point of this novel is to think about what that murder means. I want to begin with a summary of the narrative. I know that both Norman and Rachel referred to the plot throughout. I'm just going to start with the plot so you get the plot, and then I'm going to take it apart, okay? So pay attention. Possessions takes place in the country of Santa Varvara, a fictional version of the urban bicoastal United States. What does it sound like? Santa Barbara, California. But it's kind of both coasts. Gloria Harrison's housekeeper has discovered Gloria's dead body on the living room floor in her home on the morning after her murder. She is still wearing her ivory satin evening gown. Blood covers her breast and has deeply stained the front of her dress because she's been stabbed in the heart. Further, Gloria has been gruesomely decapitated. There's a narrow, jagged incision around her neck. Her head is missing. Most of those present at Gloria's dinner party from the evening before appear at the residence in the morning, having been asked to do so by Inspector Rilsky in order to give accounts of their actions and their whereabouts. Many of the hired help and Gloria's friends, including Stephanie Delacour, are quickly cleared of suspicion. Notably, Pauline Gadeau, the speech therapist and full-time nanny to Gloria's autistic and deaf-mute son, Jeremy, isn't considered a suspect, since she and Jerry left the day before to go to Gloria's country house on a short vacation. Gloria is a beautiful but icy woman, a Santa Varvaran minor celebrity known for her literary translations. After the death of her husband Stan Novak, a talented artist, Gloria had started seeing Michael Fish, a shady businessman recently turned art dealer, due to Gloria's art collection and connections, and they had become engaged. Fish, in turn, it turns out, is a sociopath, and he is the one who strangles and then stabs Gloria. He runs off with paintings from the house, but is tracked down in South America and is returned to Santa Barbara, where he's given a 10-year prison sentence. The police never discover who has decapitated Gloria. They offer the explanation that the culprit is an anonymous serial killer. Only Stephanie learns the truth, that the speech therapist, Pauline Gadeau, is responsible. Importantly, Gloria referred to her head as her sex organ. Pauline decapitated Gloria, removed her head when she returned to the house several hours after the dinner party in order to retrieve Jerry's computer games. Perhaps, Stephanie theorizes, Pauline was driven to this mad fury by Gloria's seeming lack of paternal feeling for Jerry. In Possessions, the focus is on Gloria's psychology as a victim and her part in the violence used against her. The novel reveals an escalating cycle of psychopathology and violence. In doing so, the text foregrounds the prevalent forms of mental illness in our own media-based culture, as well as our experience of a decline in shared social relations and effective political praxis in what sociologist David Hill describes as communicative capitalism. Further, the psychology of depression initiates the violence. Gloria's depressive maternal relation to her deaf-mute autistic son, Jerry, leads to her murder. Pauline Gadeau, the speech therapist, and Gloria's son, Jerry, share the digitized half-life of his autistic childhood. But after Gloria's brutal death, Pauline beheads Gloria in an autistic psychotic trance. Stephanie Delacour empathically engages Gloria's thought process, so much it's as if Stephanie is possessed by Gloria's unconscious in a narrative reenactment of the analytic transference countertransfer. I want to turn now to what I think Kristeva is doing in terms of her psychological and her social critique of the current social order. Stephanie maintains her residence in France, but spends much of her time writing about the doings of Saint-Varverins, so she's very familiar with their ordinary habits and demeanor. She tells us that Saint-Varverins wear prefabricated smiles, and they like to shut themselves up. There's no reciprocity, no exchange of ideas, no mutual consent. In the city, she sees the opacity of the faces in all those crowds milling around, and the opacity of, quote, all the things in the shops, the luxury goods, as well as the necessities. Everyone, including the sales clerks who use their computers or smile into their telephones, are also opaque. She describes the place where she's staying, an apartment owned by Gloria's brother Bob, as, quote, an opaque polyester cube, end quote. This cube provokes her question, am I inside of or on top of some building in a video game? Consumers, utterly reliant on their communicative technology, are made opaque by living entirely at the surface, seemingly simulating human being. Even Bob's personal space doesn't escape from the virtual. So the reader is further compelled to wonder whether public or private spaces make any difference in Saint-Varverin lives, since nowhere are there indications of actual human contact or engagement. From such descriptions, we might infer Kristeva's pessimistic view of the contemporary subject in the U.S. as shut up, that is, utterly self-absorbed, focused on consumption, wrapped in a blanket of the techno-habitat, with no appetite for human interaction, little capacity for reciprocity or judgment. This consciousness won't know anything and is likely very satisfied with not knowing anything of Gloria's end, except the made-for-media versions, which, as Stephanie says, tell only the story of a sad set of puppets. In describing Gloria's life and death in terms of consumable pop culture images, Kristeva is almost certainly drawing from Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, which she often references in her social criticism, particularly in her collection, Intimate Revolt, The Powers and Limits of Psychoanalysis, 2002. A founding member of the avant-garde situationist group, Debord announced in 1967, all that was once directly lived has become mere representation. Debord's indictment of the spectacular society is not without relevance, of course, to today's culture, but I think in the practice of her fiction, Kristeva is somewhere between Debord and postmodern social theorist Baudrillard. Debord wrongly argued that the classical Marxist ideal of the collective revolutionary subject freely creating society would put an end to the intermediating role of culture and communication in social life. Baudrillard, a member of the Situationists, broke with Debord and his group, and not just for their Marxist idealism. In Baudrillard's view, the very notion of representation, which presupposes a reality beyond appearance, doesn't allow us to understand the acceleration of communicative technologies that constitute social life in on-screen images, with no necessary referent beyond the simulation itself. Further, Baudrillard has argued that the human subject is dramatically altered by the culture of simulation. When social relationships increasingly take place through what David Hill has described as the quote-unquote contactless contact of social networking media, we actually become adverse to other persons, since physical presence is experienced as over-proximity, and the maximal enlargement of screen consciousness, which allows us not to be there for anyone or for anything, jeopardizes subjective psychological depth, our otherness to ourselves, as well as any sense of community with others or alienation from them. At the present conjuncture, in Baudrillard's words, the subject, deprived of all otherness, collapses into itself and sinks into autism. I don't think that Kristeva would entirely accept Baudrillard's extreme view that the very ideas of social and psychological alienation no longer apply to the new subjectivity that is developing in relation to media culture. Indeed, Kristeva seems too concerned with the future of radical political organization and psychoanalytic thought to believe that alienation has given way to autistic silence. Rather than elaborating psychopathology in new and more complicated forms. What I mean to say here is that she thinks that it's interesting to consider the kind of contemporary forms of psychopathology. However, I do think that Possessions shows us that she's well aware of the disconnectedness of cybernetic existence and the possible autistic dimensions of subjectivity in our contemporary cultural environment. We see this awareness in part in Kristeva's description of the depthless opacity of Santavarans who smile at their computers and their phones, who minimize face-to-face encounters with others, but maximize their transactional presence on the screen and don't seem the least bit bothered by the blurring of this distinction between the simulated and the actual. Whereas Stephanie cannot gain her bearings in Gloria's brother's polyester cube apartment and wonders whether she's in a video game or in someone's material personal space. Further, central to Kristeva's critical vision are the ways that Gloria's son Jerry and his nanny, Pauline Gadeau, autistically defend against the real-life passions of chaotic grief and despair associated with Gloria, or occasioned by Gloria's, that is the mother's, brutal death. Stephanie tells us that the congenitally autistic child Jerry had exchanged an enthusiasm for video games after his mother's death into an obsession with computers, and he had stitched horror away under a tissue of reasons, transforming guilt and grief into obstinate logic. Autistic super-rationality, understanding painful experience in terms of correctable mistakes in, quote, how he should have acted and revised formula for how he still ought to act now, are necessary strategies for Gloria's handicapped son. However, if successful mourning means, as Kristeva suggests, that we learn to love the dead a bit less, then Jerry's robotic response to grief is simply to cease to care at all for his mother. He didn't need her anymore. Jerry is an autistic youth coping as best he can. However, Stephanie worries that Jerry's obstinate logical attitude towards his mother's death is typical of a whole generation, that in effect, autistic responses may not just be a matter of genetics, but also of social environment, and digitized life of the last 2 decades is fostering the production of robots. She greets this new generation with a mock salute. Long live the robots. More disturbing than Jerry, whose screen existence allows him to control real-life pain and destruction, is Pauline, who has recourse to the same defenses that Jerry uses, but who suffers with major chronic depression due to her inability to grieve the death of her brother Emeric, who died as a child by drowning, or forgive her mother for what Pauline sees as unpardonable negligence in the brother's death. Jerry passively suffers his mother's frustration over his autism and witnesses her horrifically mutilated corpse. Pauline, however, expresses her own fantasy of power over what she sees as the bad mother, her own mother and Gloria. by brutally decapitating Gloria, and then occludes the pain that her violence inflicts on Jerry, as well as her own hatred. Stephanie describes Pauline's psychotic acting out where virtual and material violence are completely mixed up. When you're virtual, you never quite know if what you're doing is really done, if you're doing things or imagining them, if you're being seen or not, seeing or being, neither seeing or being, both at once or neither. The hatred of which Pauline is ignorant, that is, the unconscious hatred toward the mother, doesn't ignore her rival, Gloria. Kristeva shows that autistic psychosis may very well be the ultimate virtual state, in which there is the utmost confusion between imagining and doing. However, Kristeva still shows us that Pauline's robotic acting out in this substitute for thought, which is cold and efficient, there is a deeply held, alienated hatred, the hatred of which Pauline is ignorant. Contrary to what Baudrillard might think, the unconscious is alive and directing the human qua autistic machine. Social psychologist Valerie Walkerdine has argued that some modern acts of violence, for example, the terrible violence of American war technology, with the goal of total and omnipotent control of war, or crimes such as school shootings and other killings or brutal acts that are based on dreams of power, and here Pauline's decapitation of Gloria seems salient, might also be linked to the socialization of violence in video games and to other aspects of virtuality, namely to disconnected rationality and even to the distancing and desensitizing mechanism of the screen itself, which defends against any encounter with material pain. In Walkerdine's description, quote, a virtual state splits the subject off from and disavows the consequences of material action. Both Kristeva and Walkerdine show us how Baudrillard has missed the point that the screen easily becomes an apparatus of psychological defense. Virtual consciousness is still an alienated form of consciousness. Indeed, Pauline's major narcissistic depression due to her psychotic break demonstrates as much. However, psychotic decompensation is mounting, as Kristeva tells us in the novel, and further, it is abetted by virtuality. For these unstable persons, in Stephanie's words, what seemed unreal was becoming unstable too. People themselves were virtual, or at least becoming so. The hypnotic virtual states of game violence might all too easily lead to actual psychotic violence, since in pathological virtual states and in psychosis, the subject doesn't quite know if what she's doing is really done, or if she's doing things or imagining them. In her essay, What is Revolt Today?, Kristeva suggests that she writes Possessions not just to judge the malady of postmodernity, but also to resist it. She says in that essay, isn't it true that the various forms of the possession of our intimacy, including the most demonic and tragic, remain our refuge and our resistance in the face of the so-called virtual world, where judgments are blurred or assume archaic and barbarous form? It is precisely in the imaginary experience, particularly in literature, that this intimacy is deployed, with its timelessness and its strange forgiveness. Kristeva writes her own literary work, Possessions, in order to convey the necessity of taking possession of our intimacy. That is to say, she writes to show us how we might resist how subjectivity is lived today, namely the blurred and archaic mentality of the virtual world, by turning to the innermost aspects of human being that are constitutive and require our acceptance. Incorporating the psychoanalytic into its literary aesthetic, Possessions uses two strategies. First, in Stephanie's words, literary reminiscence of paintings to help us look death in the face. And second, Stephanie's imaginary analytic encounter with Gloria, the murder victim, in the effort to bring the novel's readers back to our innermost depths. And perhaps in doing so, Kristeva also gives us some sense of how we might refine being in the world. When, at the murder scene, Stephanie first encounters the lifeless, headless body of her friend, she alludes to many works of art portraying severed heads. That is, John the Baptist, the Stereo of Herod, and Salome, and to many other paintings by Caravaggio, his depictions of Judith, his depictions of dread Goliath's head in David's hands. These are some of what she refers to. So Caravaggio, David and Goliath, where David slices off the head of Goliath. So we're very focused on the murder victim and the decapitation, but what we are looking at is a substitute. We're looking at a piece of art that's showing us a decapitation. Do the next one. This is another one. This is John the Baptist. It's a really bad slide. I don't know if you can even see it, but he is being decapitated. And then the third slide. Okay, this is Judith and Holofernes, where Judith slices off Holofernes' head. So remember, the important thing here is not that Gloria was murdered, but that Gloria's head was sliced off, and the police couldn't figure out who took the head or why they took the head. Stephanie's memories of museum encounters allow her to express her feelings about Gloria's macabre end and help her, as Stephanie puts it, to retain my common sense, if you'll forgive the expression, to keep my head. And we find ourselves identifying with her point of view, trusting her, because we are engaged, however odd it may seem in the context of a murder investigation, with art. That is, with how it allows us to experience our feelings without being overwhelmed and to give meaning to what we see without recourse to cliché. Further, Stephanie provides a description of the painter's eye that seems grounded in Kristeva's theory of the interaction of the semiotic and the symbolic in the production of art. And this is a direct quotation from the text. The painter's eye transmutes all of these minute, chaotic stimuli into little visual correlatives. It is at once mouth, skin, ear, penis, vagina, anus, throat, all the rest. For the painter's eye covers first the five senses and then the incalculable rest of the body with a film that makes visible what cannot be seen. A moral wound, for example, or a dagger blow to the heart, or a breath or a hope cut short, become, through the luminous membrane of the artist's slightly narrowed or boldly staring eye, a tempest of red pain, a shattered face, an unnaturally long limb, or better still, one that has been lopped off. And because it transforms sensation into spectacle, the felt into the scene, the painter's eye doesn't merely reach but flies swift as an arrow to the invisible heart of the murder. In Kristeva's psycholinguistic theory, most notably from Revolution in Poetic Language, the body of the pre-Oedipal child, the child not yet psychically separate from the mother, is a medium of communication. The dyadic interaction compels the child's body to signify, as it were, at a primary sensory level, which Kristeva calls the semiotic. In Kristeva's view, the artist, who seeks to expand representation beyond the codes, standards, and conventions of our common social order, is open in ways that the rest of us are less so to the semiotic, to the syntax of unconscious states that are grounded in elusive sensation. Kristeva has written many studies that dialectically engage the semiotic and the social order in painting. And in the above quotation, we are given to understand in ways that recall Kristeva's theory that the painter's eye is deeply connected to the rest of the body, that visual symbols convey unconscious states of feeling, that are located in the mouth, the skin, the ear, the penis, vagina, anus, and throat. And this eye, narrowed slightly or boldly staring, that is focused according to its own lights, implicitly bypassing any received views, directly delivers the felt into the scene. What Kristeva is doing with his description of the painter's eye is in part recalling us to the artistic world of representation, because the real images of art are, as she says in Revolt today, a refuge and a resistance to a culture of simulations, and in part suggesting that when we open ourselves to the representation of the demonic and the tragic, we engage our innermost depths. Stephanie's psychoanalytic interpretations of Gloria's tragedy are accompanied in the novel by two additional paintings, namely Picasso's Woman with Collar and Artemisia Gentilis, Judith's Slang Holofernes. I want to address Picasso's image first because it directly bears on Gloria's relation to her son, and then take up Artemisia's image because this painting is important to how Stephanie's psychoanalytic connection to Gloria furthers her own self-understanding and moral being. Professor Igor Zorin, a child psychiatrist who takes care of Gloria's son, informs Stephanie that Jerry has copied many of Picasso's Cubist paintings of women, and one is Jerry's A Wonderful Imitation of Woman with Collar. This is Picasso's Cubist portrait, 1937, of his lover, Marie-Thérèse Walter, a depiction of a woman's full face and profile in a single image with her head sitting directly on a white collar. Zorin understands Jerry's painting as a representation of childhood ambivalence, of love and hate toward the Oedipal mother. Stephanie finds this reading too simple, at least to the extent that Zorin seems to base his idea of a violent fantasy on the son's part on the thought that the head in the portrait has been severed, as if the head was being served up on a tray. Zorin is likely reading his own musings retroactively into Jerry's motives for painting the picture. Inspector Rilsky thinks, nothing like death for turning men into poets. If not for Zorin, however, Stephanie and Rilsky wouldn't know about Jerry's copy of the Picasso, or that Gloria has placed it on the wall facing her desk. Indeed, after the murder, the painting vanished because the actual murderer, Michael Fish, the reputed fine art dealer, stole this obvious fake to throw the police off his trail. Gloria, in Stephanie's view, probably understood Jerry's imitation of the Picasso as a kind of portrait of her. However, Stephanie is able to see something in Jerry's copy that Zorin never sees. Her view of Jerry's Woman with the Collar begins with this thought, which I've already quoted, quote, "By now, what had been unreal had become unstable too. People themselves were virtual or becoming so." And then she tells us that Jerry had seen more clearly than the adults. Faces crushed, identities mocked, shots and angles that attacked or receded, changing points of view, states of mind, all in a whirl. Where were the reference points of yesteryear? Jerry connects with a Cubist rendering of the modern state of distraction as revealed in this unreal and unstable female face. When Stephanie attends the dinner at Gloria's house before the murder, she observes how Gloria's majestic but icy manner lent an air of unreality to everything. Perhaps Jerry's motivation for copying the painting is to represent his mother's unreality. However, as Stephanie's narrative of Gloria's psychical depths unfolds, we learn that her unreal face hides a major depressive disorder that begins with the birth of her deaf-mute autistic son. Perhaps then Jerry's fascination with Picasso's women derives from his experience of his mother's dissociated false self and from being in the firing line of her uncontrolled, depressive states of mind, all in a whirl. 2 of the 6 chapters of the first part of the novel are fully devoted to Stephanie's narrative process of taking possession of all of Gloria's feelings. First, Stephanie reflects on Gloria's hopes during pregnancy for her son to restore love to her life. Never a woman so happy as Gloria. During the 9 months she was carrying Jerry, a solitude for two. Bernini's ecstasy with the future added on. Then that love is tinged with traumatic suffering when, during Jerry's childhood, all his disabilities are fully manifest. This mother and talented translator who is trying to steer her son into speech and a creative use of language suffers because all her efforts to spark Jerry's linguistic creativity meet with failure. I play, I translate, you learn, it will never happen. The mother's selfless devotion grows into an invisible wound, an anguished depression, where Gloria lashes out against her son, the helpless victim of a mother's rage that was really directed at herself. Finally, Gloria cannot extricate herself from this vicious cycle of depression. Her walling herself up in masochistic guilt is followed by her rage at her helpless son, and the one state follows the other in a seemingly endless round. In this wilderness, Gloria becomes friable and frail, and she might have committed suicide and blotted out Jerry's sufferings by blotting out Jerry in person if she hadn't taken too much Elavil the night after her dinner party and allowed fish to strangle her. Stephanie invites our imaginative participation in vulnerability, since in her narration she is putting herself in Gloria's place, feeling all that Gloria has lived through. Moreover, Stephanie models how we might reflect on those shared feelings. Part of the process of understanding Gloria's effect on Stephanie herself derives from a disturbing dream that seems to encapsulate and explain her personal obsession with decapitation. And this is the Artemisia Gentili, Judith and Holofernes. So where Judith cuts off, decapitates Holofernes. Artemisia most likely chose to paint this beheading as a way to sublimate her vengefulness toward her patron who raped her. Thinking about Artemisia's painting in her dream, Stephanie's memories of having had an abortion return. She recounts her depression when, in her words, she gave birth to nothing. 7 months pregnant, she had had a therapeutic abortion due to the toxoplasmosis that had infected the brain of the fetus. Stephanie tells us that she's had more than her own share of decapitation. In her view, the abortion seems to be a beheading of the unborn child, irremediably afflicted with the brain disease. Stephanie's sad memory seems to be triggered by both Gloria's emotional decapitation, her irrational rage against Jerry, and the actual decapitation. Also, Stephanie believes that in a way she beheaded the man who impregnated her, since she canceled the father's role, never cared about him, not having known about the pregnancy or not having known about a stillborn child. In this, she seems in part to resemble Artemisia. Stephanie's deletion of her sexual partner seems vengeful. However, she admits to us that she wasn't raped. It becomes important to her to understand why she has harbored this unconscious rage against a former lover, so that she can go on to develop a responsible love for her current partner, Inspector Rilsky. Stephanie's productive interpretation of her dream is the beginning of mature self-acceptance and empathy with the other. Stephanie is able to judge herself by the measure of the vulnerability that she shares with Gloria and Artemisia, the sadness and the rage. Stephanie is nevertheless quite clear about how feelings might be shared without relinquishing differences in subjectivities. For example, Stephanie, unlike Gloria, doesn't experience the compulsion to act out her anger. And as I will show momentarily, it is, as Kristeva puts it, this concern with shared vulnerability that is crucial to the analyst and to us as readers of the analyst's fiction. Stephanie's intellectual clarity, in contradistinction to the virtual world's blurred and archaic and barbarous judgments, and her emotional growth through the process of taking possession of our intimacy, both demonstrate how Kristeva wants her novel to work as a form of refuge and resistance for readers. Further, that Stephanie, the psychoanalytically informed narrator, models a concern for sharing and for vulnerability, as Kristeva puts it in Liberty, Equality, Fraternity, and Vulnerability, also shows how the novel is for Kristeva a kind of fictional analog to the analytic encounter. As she suggestively says, in this encounter, could the disabled subject become not my analyst, but my analyzer? That the analysand is the analyzer seems to mean that it is the obligation of the analyst to ensure that the connection the analyst makes with the disabled or vulnerable analysand begins with the analyst's own subjective deficiency or vulnerability. The analyst is intuitively judged by the disabled subject on this primary level of shared vulnerability and is fully accountable for transforming this shared concern into analytic attention, patience, and solidarity. Kristeva's ethic of psychoanalysis might therefore be defined by responsible attention to shared vulnerability, and it is this ethic that has a wider application to the world outside the consulting room. In the novel, Stephanie translates her shared concern into responsible action when her connection to Gloria and to Jerry, the irremediably disabled son, compels Stephanie to care for Jerry as her ward after Gloria's death. Kristeva also says that for psychoanalysis, politics begins in a dream of citizenship with the most fragile. She continues, because to recognize the irremediable in me will help me to discover the incomparable subject in the limited body to construct a common life project. Insofar as readers begin to be concerned with recognizing ourselves in painfully depressed lives without remedy, and discover in Stephanie's example that we can only refine our being in the world through attentive and empathic sharing of that pain, then perhaps the novel is encouraging us to work through fragility to the new solidarity Kristeva envisions. In our contemporary world, where so much is breaking down, where we are depressed, specifically, we are depressed in ways similar to the characters of Possessions, who are unable to do the ethical work of love or take stock of the self, and we're rapidly losing our humanness. We deny this loss of our humanity by denying the depression that is the symptom of this loss. One means we have for denying this depression is through dissociated or unreal states, the kind that Gloria manifests. The other means is regression to violence, the psychopathology of Pauline Gadeau, or Gloria's suicidal submission to her own sociopathic lover. In Lawrence Rickles' words, regression to violence as the other means of recording and at the same time erasing holds in store the prospect of rebirth, which is less the problem's solution than its extension. The only meaningful way out of the deadlock is to recognize the sadness in our lives. Then, in David Hill's words, a fruitful space of possibility can be found in this melancholy. This working through process might allow us to reposition our orientation toward the present and toward sadness into the space where political solidarity can develop. Perhaps we can, as Kristeva says, construct a common life project.
Thank you.